I see the amplification of tariffs by the Trump administration in conjunction with this question of Russia-Ukraine as deeply connected to a promise he made as he was elected, was the president-elect, now the president of the United States. He's been saying this over and over again, that economic war is going to be coming to BRICS as a whole, going so far as to say that tariffs are going to be put on 100% on all BRICS countries. And I wanted to now play something you've been referring to, which begs the question as to how competent is Donald Trump to even address this question at all. Here's what he had to say about BRICS.
Thank you, sir.
What can we expect of the countries in NATO that spend the least amount of money, like Spain, France, below the 5%?
Spain is very low. And yet, are they a BRICS nation?
What?
They're a BRICS nation, Spain. Okay. You know what a BRICS nation is? You'll figure it out. But, and if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States. You know what the BRICS is, right? You guys know.
So Biden is gone, but the gaffes are still here, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, for spoiler alert, Spain is not part of BRICS. There are no European countries in BRICS unless, I mean, Russia and Belarus are obviously in BRICS, but they've been kicked out of Europe. They're now part of Eurasia, very much so. So a few things to respond to there. First of all, the unspoken part is that he's pressuring countries in NATO to increase their military budget to 5% of GDP. That means that he's asking many of these countries to more than double their military budget. That's absolutely crazy. Furthermore, this threat of 100% tariffs on BRICS. Now, we already talked about Russia and how putting tariffs on Russia after it's so heavily sanctioned is not going to really change anything. Russia does very little trade with the US and the West overall. However, China is concerned about more tariffs. So putting 100% tariffs on China would be a big problem for China, even though over time China's dependency on exports to the US market is decreasing. It's still a very important trading partner for China. However, let's say hypothetically the US put 100% tariffs on China. What would that mean? It would mean that all of the goods that China imports, that are imported into the US, that China exports to the US, would be twice as expensive. Think about how many things in a Walmart in the US are made in China. Double the price of all of those things. Now, defenders of the tariffs would say, well, it won't be exactly double because then the yuan will depreciate a bit against the dollar, which will cause the Chinese exports to be a little more competitive and a little cheaper. Therefore, the tariff will be slightly offset by the cost of the tariff will be slightly offset by the depreciation of the yuan. That's not wrong. Okay, maybe it's not exactly twice as expensive, but we're talking about massively increasing the costs of products that are bought by average Americans. You think that'll be a popular view? Again, Trump has this, that he constantly claims that other countries bear the cost of tariffs. It's not true. Tariffs are paid by importers. It is US importers that are going to pay the cost, and that cost will be put on to consumers. This is actually a tax on US consumers. So while Trump is pledging to continue cutting taxes on the rich and on corporations, he's reducing taxes on capital and increasing taxes on labor. This is a wealth transfer from average people in the US, from consumers to the rich, by reducing income tax and wealth tax and increasing consumer tax in the form of tariffs. And there's also a concept in economics which is important, which is called the marginal propensity to consume, which is the point that if you are a low-income worker, the more money you make, the more your consumption will increase. Because if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're, barely making ends meet and you're not buying that much food, if you make more money, you're going to buy better food and more food. You're going to, splurge on consumer goods that you wouldn't have bought earlier because you were, just trying to make ends meet. Whereas if you're extremely rich, if you have billions of dollars and you get another $1 billion, it's not going to increase your consumption basically by any level. So by increasing tariffs and therefore increasing the cost of consumer goods in the US, Trump is putting a burden on working class people, especially the poorest workers and average working people in general, not just poor people. And yet rich people will not feel those costs because rich people, they don't care if the cost of a toaster increases from $30 to $50. What do they care? They're rich. So again, okay, so if Trump's threatening these tariffs, it's going to do damage to Americans, to his own base. It is going to do damage maybe to China, but China can find alternative trading partners. Again, I've already mentioned this, but China now, its largest trading partner is Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries. It's not the US. And China trades more with the global South, with BRICS countries, than it trades with the West. Okay, so Trump puts more and more tariffs on China. All he's doing is further increasing China's economic integration with the global South. Okay, now he's saying he's going to put 100% tariffs on all BRICS countries. That includes India. If he really does that, that would be insanely stupid because the US has been trying to put divisions inside BRICS by strengthening its relations with India. Now, India, when it was a co-founder of BRICS, which originally was BRIC in 2009, and then South Africa joined in 2010. At that point, the ruling party in India was the Indian National Congress, which is a center-left party that was historically the anti-colonial party that led the liberation from British colonialism in 1947 under the leadership of the socialist anti-colonial leader Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a co-founder of the Non-Aligned Movement, and he was very deeply anti-colonial. What happened in 2014 is that a very right-wing pro-Western party came to power in India, the BJP, which is very pro-US. And since 2014, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has moved closer to the US and moved away from some of its historical anti-colonial commitments. You know, the Indian National Congress Party had a lot of problems. They moved toward neoliberalism. You know, I'm not saying that they're the best party ever. I'm not praising them, but they had those historical commitments to the anti-colonial struggle and the non-aligned movement. The BJP does not. Narendra Modi does not. They're, in the context of Indian politics, they're quite pro-West and pro-US in particular, and very pro-Trump. So when Trump was president the first time, India and the US were very close. So now is he threatening 100% tariffs on this country that the US hopes to be a counterbalance to China? Is he really? I mean, again, these are just empty threats. He's threatening BRICS as a whole, but meanwhile, there are countries in BRICS that the US wants to bring over to the US camp. Another example is, you know who's now a full member of BRICS? The United Arab Emirates. Is the US going to put 100% tariffs on the UAE? That would be hilarious because then the UAE has already been hedging its bets. I mean, I have no confidence in the UAE. This is a country that's simply acting out of its own self-interest, right? It's playing both sides. Saudi Arabia is another example. These are countries that historically were very firmly in the pro-US camp against resistance forces in West Asia, normalizing with Israeli colonialism. The UAE, they signed the Abraham Accords. They normalized with Israeli colonialism. However, these countries are led by rational leaders who can see in which way the economic winds are blowing. China is already their largest trading partner of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and of West Asia as a whole. China is by far the largest purchaser of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of oil. They don't need oil from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. exports a lot of oil. China does need a lot of oil. It produces a lot of oil, but China consumes a lot. It needs a lot of oil. So it would be really stupid. It would be economically suicidal for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to cut off their relations with the East, with China and Russia and India, and instead put all of their eggs in the U.S. basket. But if Trump puts 100% tariffs on the UAE, I mean, of course, then it will just further push the UAE to the East. So the whole point of BRICS is that BRICS is not, and they make this clear, it's not an anti-West or an anti-US alliance. They say that. BRICS is an organization that brings together Global South countries plus Russia and Belarus, which are now honorary members of the Global South. It brings them together with common shared interests, and they have two goals. They've said it very clearly. Brazil this year is the annual chair, the rotating chair of BRICS. It rotates every year. In 2023 was South Africa. Last year was Russia. Now it's Brazil. They have said that there are two goals of BRICS. One, reforming global governance institutions. And two, deepening South-South integration. What does that mean? Reforming global governance institutions means reforming the UN, which is dominated by the West, especially the UN Security Council. And it means reforming global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which are dominated by the West. The US is the only country with veto power. And when they say deepening South-South integration, they obviously mean more trade among countries of the Global South in their own currencies, not with the US dollar. So what brings together a lot of countries in BRICS, despite their very significant political differences, I already talked about the differences between China and India. However, they have shared economic interests in reforming the global financial institutions that are dominated by the US. This was spelled out very clearly in a report published by Russia in 2024 in its capacity as chair of BRICS, in which they had a blueprint for transforming, not just reforming, transforming the international monetary and financial system through de-dollarizing international trade, de-dollarizing reserves held by central banks so they can't be seized by the US unilaterally, creating alternative ways for the BRICS countries to settle trade imbalances through gold exchanges and commodities exchanges. I mean, these are the things that BRICS countries have in common. Even countries like India and China, they might have political differences, and India might lean toward the US. However, India also wants to de-dollarize because being so dependent on the US dollar is not good for India either. Even Saudi Arabia and the UAE are considering selling their oil in other currencies because China is their largest trading partner. So Trump thinks once again that tariffs are this panacea or magical. He just threatens tariffs and everything is solved. But if he puts 100% tariffs, not only in China, but also in India, on the UAE, on Ethiopia, which is now part of BRICS, all it's going to do is just further incentivize these countries, some of whom are trying to play both sides and they're kind of on the geopolitical fence. It'll push them firmly into China's arms, which Trump says he doesn't want to do. But I mean, China is the main target of the US empire. This is bipartisan. Read all of the major reports published in the past few years, the National Defense Strategy. They all say that China is the biggest so-called threat. Marco Rubio said this in his Senate hearing to be confirmed as Secretary of State. The CIA director, William Burns, under Biden, said the same thing. They all say China is the biggest threat, in scare quotes. I think that's absurd. China's not threatening anyone in the US. China hasn't been involved in a war since 1979. But they mean that China is the only country powerful enough to challenge the global dictatorship of US imperialism, of US hegemony. So threatening all of BRICS would be a perfect way to increase China's integration with all of the other BRICS countries, which now represent 55% of the global population. There are now 10 members of BRICS and 9 partners of BRICS, including some of the most populous countries on Earth. Indonesia, one of the most populous countries on Earth, just joined BRICS. So if Trump puts 100% tariffs on Indonesia, good luck getting Indonesia to ever do anything that the US wants. Indonesia is another one of these countries that has leaned more toward China, but has also been kind of playing both sides and has good relations with the US. Putting 100% tariffs on Indonesia would be the complete end of any goodwill between the US and Indonesia and any other BRICS country.
Yeah, and it's not just you saying it, Ben. You know, there is also the even the mainstream media here. The BRICS bloc is growing, and Trump's tariff threat isn't expected to put off aspiring members. And I wanted to just scroll down to what it says, and they refer to a source in the Chatham House, which is a U.S. government-funded think tank. China's already starting to do this, meaning to become an alternative to the United States, especially around responding to this trade war, putting forward a zero tariff policy for least developed countries with diplomatic ties with China, which came into effect from December last year and built on similar measures extended to the least developed African countries. So, Ben, this is exactly what you're saying. You're saying China already is providing this kind of alternative. Squeezing all of BRICS will only bring these countries closer to China. It only makes economic sense. Talk about, you're in China. Talk about what you've learned about the ways in which China just does business differently, which makes these threats against BRICS by Trump so illogical or even dangerous for the United States as an empire itself.
Yeah, a few things. So Trump, again, when he's talking about the use of tariffs, he's talking about blanket tariffs. There's a difference, a huge difference between blanket tariffs and tariffs in particular industries. Look, for instance, the Biden administration. Now, I'm deeply opposed to the Biden administration's use of tariffs, which is a form of, economic war on China. However, you can argue that the Biden administration's use of tariffs was smarter, at least from the perspective of an imperialist, right? Again, I'm not supporting them in any way, but he was targeting specific industries in China where the U.S. wanted to prevent China from competing with U.S. corporate monopolies. So, of course, this is a way by which the U.S. was trying to protect, the U.S. government was trying to protect U.S. big tech corporations. A good example of this is Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla. He gave a call with investors in which he said that if protectionist measures were not put on Tesla, that Chinese electric vehicles would completely destroy Tesla. He complained that Chinese EVs are the best in the world. They're very good and they're very cheap. And he's right about that. I've seen them. They're amazing and they're very cheap. They're like 1/3 or 1/4 the cost of a Tesla and just as good quality, if not better. So what happened? A few months later, the Biden White House put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, which means that if they're imported into the US, which is very unlikely because importers won't do it because of the high tariffs, but even if they do, they'll be twice as expensive roughly in the US, which means that Tesla can compete with these Chinese EVs that are cheaper and better. Okay. Trump saying, I'm not going to put specific tariffs on specific products and industries. I'm going to put 100% tariffs or 60% or whatever, blanket tariffs on everything from China or from other BRICS countries. Okay, so what you're saying is that those countries are just going to trade with other countries. They're not even going to trade with the U.S. The U.S. does have leverage because it has a very big market. The U.S. doesn't produce anything. It's deindustrialized. Very little. It produces weapons and horrible Netflix movies and debt. The main thing that the U.S. produces is actually financial instruments that capitalists around the world invest in and hold their wealth in. It produces debt. It has the U.S. dollar. It prints a lot of dollars. That's the main thing that the U.S. has. It's the advantage. And because of the way the global financial system was set up at the end of World War II, the dollar was made the global reserve currency. Its link to gold was ended in 1971 by Richard Nixon. So the U.S. has this ability, this Rumpelstiltskin ability, as Aaron Good says, where it can just print more and more dollars, and then it can import the products produced by workers around the world. And then how does it balance that? It sells debt. It sells off financial assets, including U.S. Treasury securities, including stocks, which is partial ownership in U.S. companies, including real estate, which pushes up the price of real estate. Okay, so this is one of the main reasons that the cost of living has become so high in the U.S. because rich people around the world hold their wealth in the form of U.S. assets. They buy up U.S. real estate, pushing up prices in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, which means that average working people can't afford them. So homelessness becomes worse and worse. Okay, so if Trump says we're going to tariff you, you can't get access to our market, that is the only advantage the U.S. has left because the U.S. doesn't produce anything really. So if these other countries can find alternatives to the U.S. market, the U.S. is losing the last advantage it has, other than the massive military it has. So once again, this is going to massively backfire at the U.S. Now, China, you mentioned, has been ending its tariffs on tariffs it has with developing low-income countries. So I mentioned earlier that I'm not against specific use of tariffs, but for developing countries that are trying to compete with the very wealthy, established economies, they use tariffs as a form of infant industry protection. I mentioned earlier that this was exactly the strategy used by every developing country, including the United States, including Alexander Hamilton. He invented this idea, the first Treasury of the the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. What does that mean? When China was developing and industrializing, it used some forms of protectionism to develop its own local industries, because if you're going to make a car industry from scratch, how are you going to compete with Toyota? How are you going to compete with Ford? You can't do it from scratch. You will never be able to. You need to use some kind of protection to develop your local industry. And when it gets to the point where it's competitive and making high quality cars, then you can slowly lift the tariffs, reduce the protectionist measures, and your cars can compete internationally. This is what every advanced economy did, including the United States, including the UK, including Japan, including South Korea, and yes, China as well. But, Western neoliberal economists point to China and complain, claiming about the protectionist policies in China. Elon Musk does this a lot, not mentioning that this is what the United States did, and now it's what the U.S. is returning to, because the U.S. no longer has the economic advantage. And the U.S. preached free trade when it benefited U.S. companies, U.S. corporate monopolies. And now that they can no longer compete with Chinese companies, they're going back to protectionism, because they only preach competition when it's beneficial to them. When it's no longer beneficial to them, they want to be put behind protective walls of tariffs. Okay, so China is lifting now that China also no longer needs many of these tariffs because it has very advanced technology and very good competitive industries. China is also lifting tariffs. This is a natural process that every advanced economy has done. What does that mean? That means that now other countries can have access to the Chinese market. China has 1.4 billion people. This is the potential for a massive market. And China is trying to increase domestic consumption. So this is a natural process that is mutually beneficial for its trading partners in BRICS and for China itself. So what is Trump going to do here? Because again, the advantage that the U.S. has right now is it has this massive market, and it simply prints dollars to import all of these products. By using tariffs, the U.S. is blocking off access to this massive market. So it's destroying the last advantage that the U.S. has. And Trump says that he's going to reindustrialize the U.S., but I would add that that's not going to happen, because in order to reindustrialize, you have to take on Wall Street. There are two options. You can serve the financial sector or serve the manufacturing sector. They are antagonistic. You cannot have both. If he wants to reindustrialize the U.S., first of all, he has to massively devalue the U.S. dollar. You know who's going to fight tooth and nail to prevent that from happening? Wall Street. You know who fills his administration? Representatives from Wall Street. Who is Trump's Treasury Secretary? A billionaire hedge fund manager, Scott Bessent. Okay, there are 13 billionaires in the Trump administration. They are not going to accept a significant devaluation of the U.S. dollar, which would be needed to make U.S. exports competitive if it actually wants manufacturing in the U.S. to be competitive. It's not going to happen. It's insanely expensive. Everything in the U.S. is insanely expensive. Okay, so he needs to go after Wall Street, which he's never going to do. Especially Trump is a guy who, when he was president the first time, he would just constantly tweet about the stock market. He said, look how great the Dow Jones is doing. Okay. The other thing he would need to do is return to industrial policy, which, again, for all of the many criticisms of the Biden administration, Biden was one of the worst presidents in my lifetime. There have been a lot of bad presidents.
Sure.
He actually was trying to do this kind of industrial policy through things like the Inflation Reduction Act and through the CHIPS Act, which was providing significant government support for reshoring strategic high-tech manufacturing of things like semiconductors and electric vehicles in the U.S. Trump is now ending all of those policies. So he's getting rid of the industrial policy that would be needed to make US manufacturing competitive. So he's not going to reshore all of this manufacturing. It's all bluff. I think what's actually going to happen is a further acceleration of the process we've seen in recent years, which is known as friendshoring or nearshoring. Instead of actually making these manufactured goods in the US, it's going to be made, they're going to be made in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Mexico, in countries that are, they're not necessarily US allies, but they're countries that have advanced manufacturing capabilities, and they're countries that the US can see as a potential partner that is not firmly allied with China. So the funny thing about those countries that I just mentioned is that most of them are interested in BRICS. Indonesia's in BRICS. Vietnam has been invited to be a BRICS partner. Mexico is probably not going to join BRICS because it has the threat of the US just hanging right over it. So India is a country that's being considered as a place where the US is trying to pressure a lot of companies like Apple to move their manufacturing from China to India. But what's happened is that Apple has said we can't do it because it's very difficult to develop the supply chain locally. The US is learning this as well. The US is deindustrialized. It has lost the entire supply chain locally in the US. This means that, one, they have to develop the so-called human capital. That means the workers. They have to train the workers who have to work in these factories. You have lost generations of workers. They don't know how to make these products. And there's so much of this is automated now. It's very complex. So they've lost that. They've lost the infrastructure that you would need. You need very good, high quality infrastructure to transport these goods. The US infrastructure is falling apart. You need low costs of production. Everything in the US is expensive. Housing is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Transportation is expensive. Okay, so they now think that they can have India that can magically replace China. India faces the same problems. Infrastructure is not very good and it's very expensive. They don't have the developed workforce. So they don't have the capital investment that they need, which is very expensive as well. All of that investment has been done in China. This is trillions of dollars of investment. So again, tariffs are not going to magically, just blanket tariffs are not going to magically solve all of these problems. I mean, again, the Trump administration, Trump himself thinks he can just threaten tariffs and it'll solve everything. It's not going to happen.